Welcome to our second webinar. We are going to be discussing and looking at some of the questions and the style of questioning being asked across the three main domains of the PISA 2025 assessment for this year. As you can see, we are recording this, so you'll be able to look back on it and share it with your colleagues and networks. Ian, would you like to go into the next slide, please? Thank you. Very quickly, the agenda is very much jam-packed. So quick introductions. We are going to look at what PISA is, but the main meat of this afternoon's discussion is going to be around the three main domains, reading, mathematics and science. And then we have the opportunity to do a group discussion and then some practical hints and tips around how we can support our young learners in this assessment for this year. Ian, next slide, please. So we're going to ask the what, the why, and really try and open this big black box that is PISA. What is it? What do we do? And what do the young people do when they're doing this testing? Next slide, please, Ian. So at this point, I'd like to introduce you to Keith Dryber and David Thomas. Keith Dryber from Scottish Government and David Thomas from the National Foundation for Educational Research. If I can invite you both in and take us through this part about the framing of PISA and what it means. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Margaret. So as I mentioned, I'm Keith Dryber. I'm a researcher in Scottish Government in learning analysis, and I'm the contract manager for PISA, so I work really closely with our contractors, David and the National Foundation for Educational Research, to make sure the assessment happens well in Scotland, and also responsible for analysis and reporting of the PISA data. But just before we jump into PISA, I just wanted to flag that this is part of sort of a wider international surveys timeline. So we've always taken part in PISA since the year 2000, but we've now rejoined PIRLS, which is the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, which will next take place next year in 2026. And this looks at literacy levels in 9-year-olds in primary schools. And then following that will be in the Trends in International Maths and Science Study, or TIMS, which will be in 2028 and looks at two key stages, primary 5 and S2. And following that, straight back into PISA, so PISA 2029. So just to put into context, there are a number of international surveys that are happening, and they're particularly important for the Scottish Government and the education system in terms of sort of insights and evidence into how the education system is working and how we compare to other countries. So just move to the next slide, that'd be great. And I'll hand over to David.
Thank you very much, Keith. That's great. I'll just start with an introduction of the PISA assessment, but just remind you all that you can find out more on the Education Scotland PISA support package web pages. Just specified, sorry, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah, that's the one, thank you. The PISA study it's organised by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development as a sort of international organisation with an interest in policy in lots of areas, and PISA has the broad purpose of providing a depth of valid comparable performance data on what works well in education, both between different countries and over time. It achieves this analysis by assessing the performance of a sample of students from each of the education systems that participate, and as we've heard, there are three main domains of assessment, which are reading, mathematics and science, plus every time there's an innovative domain, which this time is called Learning in a Digital World, which looks at computer skills in real-world problem-solving scenarios. For 2025, as we've also mentioned, science is the main focus domain, which means that about half of the questions that students will be presented with will be science, and there are also there's a particular questionnaire that students have to complete, and there'll be questions on science within that as well, to look a little bit more in depth at the teaching and learning around science. The assessment is specific for students towards the end of their compulsory secondary schooling. So it's around about age 15. When PISA was last done in 2022, it was administered to students in 81 different countries, which are shown on the map on the right there. And there was a total of about 700,000 learners internationally participated in the assessment. So it's a really big worldwide assessment that happens. Important really for our discussions today is that for the assessment results to be valid, it needs to be a comparable experience for all of those learners in all of those different countries, in all of the languages that they'll sit the test in, and that guides a lot of the development of the assessment and the format and questions, which we'll cover later in this presentation. If I could have the next slide, please, Ian. Thanks. This covers many of the practicalities of the administration of PISA. The assessment will happen in the autumn. Around about 120 institutions have been sampled for inclusion. If you have, you'll know about it. We don't need to know about that in this meeting. The inclusion is anonymous, but that's the approximate sampled coverage of the Scottish education system. And relevant to today's discussion is the assessment. So the assessment will take about 3 hours. It includes 2 hours of assessment material for the students and about 40 minutes of that student questionnaire that I mentioned, obviously with breaks in between to help the students. Each student will see a different set of assessment content, and most of the units for the main domains are what we call multi-stage, follow the multi-stage adaptive testing model. This actually means that students will be routed to high or low ability units at different checkpoints throughout the assessment, dependent on their performance in auto-scored content in the previous unit. So this allows for the test to be differentiated to different student abilities, which I think is important to mention up front here. Also, as we've mentioned, all of the administrative activities are arranged between NFER and the schools, including study administrators who will come in and organise the test delivery on the day, and all of the included schools have the information that they require for that. I'll now pass back over to Keith, who will talk about the what the Scottish Government has learned specifically from some of these assessments in the past.
Thank you, David. So if you can move on to the next slide, that'd be great. So just quickly before we get into the substance of the presentation, just want to add, why do we take part in PISA? For Scottish Government, for education policymakers, it's fantastically useful international comparative data on education over time. So as mentioned, we've taken part since the year 2000, so we have effectively 25 years worth of data on how the education system and education is working in schools in Scotland, but in those other 80 plus countries as well. And this gives us insights into the factors that both support attainment and well-being. It's often the scores, which you can see on the right here, which get into the media, but it's the things like the chart underneath that really gives you the value of PISA. So understanding the changes in people's well-being in terms, feeling of belonging at school, whether they feel that they make friends easily. It's these kind of soft indicators that PISA does well and linking that attainment and well-being. And taking this, we can provide evidence to support policy developments, such as at the moment the curriculum improvement cycle. So we're working closely with colleagues in Education Scotland to really look at how maths is taught, how well-being is included in the curriculum, how STEM is included, and lots of insights there. And wider than that, it's a really useful data set that can be used by academic researchers to provide more insights. For schools and pupils, for pupils, it's an opportunity to practice assessment skills through an innovative, low-stakes online assessment. An experience of representing Scotland in international study. As David mentioned, there are more than 700,000 students that take part every 3 years, and about 3,000 of them will be from Scotland. So it's an interesting thing for people to take part in and to be able to contribute to a study that helps us better understand the education system. So their experiences directly impacts on how education works in Scotland. And for schools, everything above, but then also data and insights are provided to schools from the student questionnaire responses. So that means you can understand at school level what PISA is telling you. So I think I'm handing back to Margaret this one.
I think there's one more slide for me, is there?
Oh, apologies, David.
That's no problem.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, before we looked at the questions in detail, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background, really, from my perspective in working with PISA and PISA questions over many years. And I'm aware that they do look different to what most students usually see in national assessments. And I just wanted to sort of give you the PISA perspective on that. I think what's important when we look at the framework documents, at the outline of the purpose of PISA, that what we're trying to do with these questions is to assess how well students are prepared by their schooling for an understanding of science that will help them to make informed personal decisions about science or subject-related issues, for example, in science about health and environment. And PISA achieves this analysis by real-world contexts that are targeted to sort of students' interests and lives, but that poses some different constraints really on how the questions are constructed. So new contexts need to be introduced and described, and they have to have enough subject-specific detail for students to provide answers. So there's often more written explanation than you might see in national assessments, especially if those have a sort of shared understanding of taught content. And secondly, the explanations have to be clear, as I've said before, in multiple different languages, so students sitting the question can respond to in a similar way, irrespective of where they are in the world. And that, again, will make them a bit more wordy or a bit more explanatory. So this results in it a bit more detail being included than perhaps we might expect otherwise. But I think an important point to remember is that we're not just testing the students as we are in a national assessment. This is actually testing the education system rather than the student, and it's low stakes for the student. There's no jeopardy in the students taking time to read through and understand the context and having a go at what they think in that question. And even if they do find it challenging, remember that there are also hundreds of thousands of other students all over the world who are in the same position as Scottish students. That's it from me, Margaret. Next slide.
Thank you so much. That was great. Just going to introduce you now to Paul. I think this is your section. You're going to come in on this one, are you?
Yes, that's right, Margaret. Hi, everyone. So my name is Paul Roger. I'm Head of Science at Larbert High School, and for the last few months I've been seconded to work for Education Scotland as an Education Scotland associate, and my responsibility area is PISA. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about funnily enough, the maths questions, which come on to a bit later. But I think what I want to say, first of all, from myself and my fellow science colleagues that have been involved in this process, the kind of overriding message is that, you know, if possible and your school is selected, to please try and let your pupils that are selected get some experience of the PISA practice questions. These are readily available, as we'll show you, on the PISA OECD website, and they are a little bit unfamiliar, both in terms of style and functionality, as we'll come on to see. And I'm just thinking from my own context, we wouldn't be giving pupils an unfamiliar test in school without preparing them for what they're about to experience. So I think that's quite important. However, as Principal Teacher of Science, I do also very much recognise that timetables and the general busyness of schools, secondary schools, throughout the whole year really, and also the fact that these pupils will span almost definitely 2 different year groups, make this a logistical challenge for schools. So the first thing to say, as you can see from the screen, there are lots and lots of example practice paper questions to look at, with really good explanations of the answers and things like that for pupils to go through. If you choose to use these with your pupils and you can force them time to work with them, then that's great. And the links will be available in the chat on this as well as on the OECD website. I've just basically Googled OECD PISA test questions or science or math test questions, and it comes up straight away. I must say that now that myself personally is more familiar with the style of questions and the kind of interactive nature of them, they're definitely something that I would be used with my own classes as well. So they're useful in and of themselves. So that's something that's worth pointing out to science, maths, and other teaching staff that are out there as well. So I'll definitely be using these within different contexts of, for example, our science and biology curriculum at Larbert High. So they're a worthwhile tool, even if for schools not involved in PISA. So let's start looking at some of these examples with the maths content. So Ian, if you can just jump down a couple of slides, please, that would be great. And the next one, yeah, great. Thank you. So full disclosure, as you probably noticed, I'm not a maths principal teacher. Last week for the first session of this, my colleague Jamie McDonald, principal teacher in maths here at Larbert, led the session. These sessions are recorded, so I will do my best, obviously. But you might get some more deeper insight from Jamie's, from you watching Jamie's sessions. But give me a chance. So I'm going to just show you that on this first slide, what I would say are the kind of headlines for the maths content of the PISA assessment. As David said, the focus this year is obviously science, but there'll still be a significant maths, a significant number of maths and literacy or reading questions, as we call them. We'll also give you some time at the end of each section to try out some of the subject-specific content on your own before we move on, so you can get a feel for the questions yourselves. So let's look at some. So I should take you through these, and I think the kind of message that Jamie picked out from, and also one of his colleagues, was that looking at the questions, the feel of them will be more familiar to pupils who are on a National 5 maths, applications of maths pathway, if you like. A focus on numeracy, geometry, statistics was kind of the key ones from the practice papers, the exemplar questions that are up there. Style of questions, some of them are on a par with the difficulty of Nat 5 apps, but some questions, for various reasons, are significantly more complex, particularly in terms of the wording and the volume of text. So it'd be good to prepare pupils for this, again, with that kind of practice if possible. If you can jump on to the next slide, Ian. Thank you. So we're just going to look at some specific examples of the maths questions. So first up, this is an example of what would be kind of very similar to a kind of basic National 5 applications of maths question. It's taking maths from this real world context, kind of idea of pretty much the whole of the applications of maths course. Limited use of skills like algebra or trig or anything like that. And again, the pupils just need to don't need to round to any decimals, no need to consider the different orientations of the boxes, just how many would fit in the space based on the dimensions given. The questions then evolve, so as you'll see later on, we click through the questions. That would be the first question that people would face. So Ian, if you go on to the next one, you can see the complexity increases as the question progresses. The pupils type their answer for the first part, and then they select those arrows at the top to move along onto part 2. And firstly, part 2 is definitely more wordy, and David gave some very good justification of the reasons for that, obviously, earlier on. So it's important to point out that is to do with partly the level, but also partly the fact that it's that worldwide context, this assessment taken by pupils across a huge number of different countries. And later on, Helen and Andrew will take you through some of the literacy challenges and examples. But this question probably a bit more than S3, S4, which is what we're talking about, really, maths pupils in Scotland would be used to in their average maths assessment at that stage. And as mentioned, pupils who maybe started in applications of maths pathway might be more familiar with that. Okay, so we're now involved in some fractions and decimals. There's multiple boxes being placed in different orientations, a bit of higher order thinking to determine whether each of those statements that you see there is correct or not. And again, I think slightly more difficult language. Ian, if you can move on to the next one. So we've picked out here, this is from the National 5 Maths Apps paper. And as you can see, the text for that is much, much more limited. And the instructional question is a little bit, arguably a bit clearer for the pupils. Calculate the maximum number of boxes that will fit in the van. That's the kind of question that we get at that level, a sort of comparative question at National 5 Apps. So to be clear, that is not a PISA question, that's taken from a National 5 Apps past paper. So the answer just numerical here, no explanation required. Thanks, Ian. Can you jump on to the next one, please? So then there's a little some probability questions in here. So again, something that's covered in maths courses across the country, and also particularly, as I said, the applications of maths course. On the face of it, this first part's quite straightforward, but sometimes people start to panic a bit when they see that explain your answer type thing. So again, giving examples prior to the PISA assessment will build our confidence here. And again, this might be a useful question to use as you'll see as it progresses, just with your classes in general. Sorry, Ian, thank you. On to the next one. I'm going to skip through these quite quickly because I'm going to show you these in a wee demonstration shortly. If I can get my screen sharing working, hopefully. So the sort of the next little bit here, I'm going to run through this in a couple of moments. This is just a screenshot, but we'll run through how we do this. And what we find a few questions in the maths and science sections, they need to fill in, or they don't fill in, but they click on a button to fill in to populate a table or a spreadsheet. And this is something that where we think it'd be good to get that practice in terms not just of the content of the questions, but in terms of the functionality of the questions as well. So I'm going to demonstrate this and then let you have a wee go at it. And here's the next part of that question, I think, come up. This might be the next one. Sorry, can you just jump on again, Ian? Thank you. And then again, we can see that the question is getting now a little bit more complicated again. And again, we'll show you through the simulator and give you a wee shot at that afterwards. So I'm going to now attempt to screen share. I'm a bit of a Teams Luddite. I'm a Google Meet sort of guy, so I'm going to share my screen with you just now. Give me a wee second. That's worked. And again, these links will be posted to you in the chat or sent out to you to access them. If I just show you the full screen there, actually, it shows you the PISA test, the reading questions, the mathematics questions, the science questions, and so on. Because this is from 2022, it's worth pointing out that maths was the focus in 2022, so there are a lot more math sections than there are, for example, science or reading. So that's how that kind of balance is struck, if you like. And I'm sure it will be similar in 2025. So I'm going to click on the spinner's question. This works. Off the screen a little bit. So you can see here we've got Peter's class going to an experiment to get spinners. Peter thinks there's a greater probability of the arrow stopping in blue in spinner A than there is in spinner B. Okay, and the pupils need to select the correct answer, and then whatever they type in there, they've got to give their little explanation. But I want to show how how we click through the screens, and especially the next slide. So I'm going to just put in just because something that I think before you can move on. So what you notice is once the answer is submitted, they give you sometimes a really quite detailed answer section with an explanation as a pop-up. It's not just the answer, but the justification of why this is maybe regarded as classed as a moderately difficult question, they say. And that's why also if you scroll down, you'll see there's a partial credit given to this one. So it's not just right or wrong, they've got partial credit for doing certain aspects of it correctly. Okay. And I just want to show you how the simulator works. So we're now on to the second part of that question. This is just to show you, this just shows the pupils, so they need to follow the instructions on the left-hand side. There is no question here though. This is to show them how this runs. So what they're told to do is to move the slider to set the number of spins along here, and then to click run on the button to see the results. So again, I just feel if they're shown this beforehand, they're going to get the idea of these kind of questions. And later on, Helen's going to show you a kind of more drag and drop one that there is in the sciences. So it's just quite good from the functionality point of view to give them practice of this. We then run it and it populates the table, and then it says, good, please click the next arrow to continue. We do so, and now we get the question that we know how to work the table. So we talk about the theoretical probability and how that increases the larger the number of spins is the kind of idea that they're trying to get across here. So I suppose the key phrase in the question here is as the number of spins increases. So they need to actually do that on the table. So they firstly select 10 spins, leave it at 10 and click run. They'll then move it up if they get the right idea to 50. And they can do all of them if they want, or just a selected few, but they should always get the pattern that as we increase the number of spins, what we call the theoretical probability, and to the depth of my maths knowledge here, increases. So in other words, that split of roughly 16% between them all becomes much more consistent. So the more that you do, the higher closer it gets, sorry, to that theoretical probability. So that's one example of that. I'm going to just come out of screen sharing now, and I'd like to give you, or we'd like to give you a little chance to have a go at these. I think, Margaret, were we thinking maybe 5 minutes on this? Does that sound reasonable? Too long? Is that okay?
Yeah, a couple of minutes. I think what you need to maybe explain is where they can actually access it. So if you've got the QR code there.
Yeah, sure. I'll pop that back up just now. In fact, Margaret, if I can just stop sharing just now, I'll it's on the next slide actually, so I'll just do that now if I can manage. There we go. Okay, so if you can pop, Ian, if you can pop the code back up, that's great. So if you just can scan the QR code, we'll also put a link in the chat, Margaret, is that possible, just to get to those questions? I've done, oh, I can't see the chat there, sorry.
Yeah, I will turn it back on.
Thank you. And then if you take, we'll just say, I'll start up again in about 3 minutes time. Have a play about with a couple of different questions. So once you click on the link there, you'll see all the maths questions. The one I was working on was obviously called Spinners. There's also one below that which you can have a play with, which involves filling out a spreadsheet. I can show you that one in the previous slide shortly, but I'll give you all a chance to sort of scan the QR code or click on the little link in the chat, and you can have a play around with that. You'll see all the maths questions there. You'll see also science, that's the same link that's got the science and English, science and reading, I should say, questions, and some other example questions there as well. Okay, and I'll pop back on in about just before 4:35, just to introduce the science input. Okay, many thanks. Questions on various different topics. Science will be the focus, so obviously there's going to be more questions on this, as I said earlier. And I'm going to now hand over to Helen and Andrew, who will introduce themselves, and they'll take you through the science questions in a bit more detail, and also look at the literacy content, the reading section and the literacy content, particularly of the PISA assessments. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Helen Scally, and I'm the Principal Teacher of Chemistry at Turnbull High School, and also doing a bit of work as an Education Scotland Associate this year for PISA. So as we've kind of heard this year, the main focus is the science domain, and you can see that there are a variety of different questions available for us to practice and to have a look at. Some are interactive. Those would be the ones the last time that science was the main domain, so 2015. You can see on the screen as well, there's the 2015 main survey science questions. That's a larger document that I'll show you in a couple of slides time. And then there's also some exemplar questions to help prepare young people for the 2025 science questions specifically. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. What we should see is a sample of, yeah, here we go. So the sort of 2025 exemplar questions, these are the ones that are interactive. So if we just go to the slide, please, Ian. And you can see some of the different types of questions and the different themes that there are interactive versions of the assessment for us to use. So as people have mentioned before, it's really about young people being able to apply their knowledge and understanding in those real world contexts. So it is a little bit unfamiliar potentially to them, but it's a really innovative and hopefully might even be enjoyable for young people to do this assessment, just to really test their knowledge and their understanding of science concepts. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. As we're sort of going through these, obviously we want our young people and learners to be as familiar with the questions and as kind of to minimise stress as much as possible. So you'll see that there's a little question mark at the top, which helps them kind of navigate through a help menu. So it'll help them to try and understand how to work the simulations. And you can also see, as you've seen in the maths questions as well, there are kind of little sliders to use and different variables that they can change in order to do their scientific inquiry as part of this assessment. So the simulations are really kind of interesting and an innovative way for them to apply their science knowledge and understanding. So we can just move on to the next slide, please. Here, we've got an example from that 2015 set of questions, and it's about sustainable fish farming. As we talked about before, there are reasons why the questions are different to what our learners in Scotland would be more familiar with in terms of the literacy. So there's a lot more kind of that they're expected to read in order to really understand the context of the question and then be able to apply their knowledge to it and their science skills to it. So this one is really about a sustainable fish farm. They have to have a look at a little activity to see where they can place different organisms in order to make sure that the fish are fed and also that the water quality is maintained. If we just go into the next slide, please. And it is kind of designed to be a bit engaging. So this is a little diagram, obviously, of the sustainable fish farm. And after their introduction, they're asked to kind of place these organisms in the best tanks in order to ensure that the fish farm is working appropriately. So I'm actually just going to share my screen, I think, and show you what this actually looks like. So I will do this. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see my screen just now. So this is the introduction section, and as I said before, it talks about the kind of background to the fish farming. They navigate through the arrows at the top. And we come to this first question. There is quite a bit to read, so they need to understand the purpose of the fish farm. They are farming common sole, and their preferred food is ragworms. They're given some other organisms that are going to be also placed into the fish farm, including the microalgae, ragworms, the shellfish, and marsh grass. They're then, they need to decide in which tank each organism should be placed. So they're dragging and dropping the organisms to the appropriate tank. So they're really needing to understand that the common sole is what we are farming, and the fish that are getting harvested from this tank, so they need to go there. They also need something to eat, so they have to have their source of energy, so that would be their ragworms. But then as this is a sustainable fish farm, they need to minimise any nutrients and wastes that are being returned to the ocean. And so they're going to be needing to place their shellfish here that will feed on extra microalgae, and then the marsh grass that's going to absorb any nutrients and wastes from the water. So you can kind of introduce that to your learners in helping them prepare for these types of assessments. And then on my browser, unfortunately, I don't get the feedback coming up. I think it's a bit of a glitch, but it might work on your own browsers. The next question, again, gives them the sort of information that they need to be able to answer it, and then ask them an additional question, and it's about the researchers noticed the water that had been returned to the ocean had a large quantity of nutrients. What do they need to add in order to reduce that problem? And what they need to recognise is that the grasses would absorb the nutrients and wastes, and so they need to click that one there. So that's a simple kind of multiple choice question there. And again, I will let you kind of click your way through this yourselves as well. And this last question just asks them what procedure would make the fish farming more sustainable. So this is them kind of understanding about what the term sustainable means and how they can apply this to this fish farm. And so the correct answer there, I believe, would be using the waste produced by the organisms to make fuel to run the water pumps. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen just now, and hopefully we can bring the slides back up. You can again have a couple of minutes just to try that question yourself. I think this QR code will just take you directly to that fish farm question, but you can use the previous links as well to have a look at other science questions. It might be that your browser doesn't have the glitch that I have, and you'll get the feedback coming up after each question. But I'm going to show you where that feedback and the kind of granularity about the specific assessment questions and where that's found on the OECD web page. So I think I'll just give you another 2 or 3 minutes. Maybe we'll come back at about 46 minutes past on my clock, and then we'll take it from there. Extra information about the type of question and also the kind of difficulty ratings of that. If we just move on to the next slide. And you'll see, yep, it is a 29-page PDF, so there's a lot of information there. It gives the screenshots of the interactive questions from 2015, the question type data, and also level of difficulty and why those questions are more challenging than others. And it also gives the scoring criteria and comments, so it's helpful just to work out if you got the right answer or not yourself. We can move on to the next page, please. And so here was the kind of drag and drop commentary, and you can see that this is quite an open question, so it had a level of challenge of 6, I think, so quite a high level of challenge. There's multiple ways of getting this incorrect, but it is completely kind of quite open in the way that the young people are answering it. If we just move on to the next slide, please. So as well as the 2015 questions, which are interactive, there are also additional questions which are there to hopefully prepare the young people for this year's assessment. So that's the 2025 Science Exemplar questions. And these you can see are listed here, and it's also on the OECD web page. They're mostly different topics to the interactive question pack, but again, they're really hopefully relevant and interesting to young people so that they can apply their science knowledge in that real life context. So it's probably a good place to start. If we move on to this next slide, please, Ian. So we've got our screenshots in this area of the web page and also brief commentaries. And as I said, because these are designed to prepare the young people for this year's assessments, it's probably a good place to start. And this also links me into start to talk about the literacy aspects of these questions, because they are quite different to what learners would see in the SQA assessments. And you can see that this kind of introduction as well is quite wordy, just to give that context to the situation that they're going to be applying their knowledge from. So if we move on to the next slide, we're just going to have a wee look at this. And the next slide again, please, Ian. So what colleagues at Education Scotland did was they actually took some of the questions and put them into Hemingway Editor app, which takes a piece of text and then grades it according to its readability. So you can see that this introduction to the question is coming out at a grade 13, which is quite an advanced reading scale or reading age, I guess, or grade. And grade 9 would be considered to be kind of adult level readability. So there are some sentences there that are kind of hard to read maybe, or some words that could have simpler synonyms like put in instead of it. And so it was interesting for us when we're thinking about preparing young people for these assessments to compare that with SQA assessments. So if we just have a look at the next slide, please. And you can see this is a question from the National 5 Physics exam from 2024, which is how we would be assessing or kind of testing young people's application of science in an open-ended question. And it's quite a bit more kind of straightforward, streamlined and to the point. And that would have a readability grade of 7. So I guess what we don't want young people to sort of lose confidence, to become stressed or worried about these. So we just want to make them familiar with the type of questions, that there is going to be a bit more reading, and the reason why, because we're assessing and we're looking and we're interested in their application of science and their actual kind of science inquiry skills. If we can move on to the next slide, please. And at this point, I'm going to pass on to Andrew Thompson, who's my colleague here at Turnbull High School. He's an English teacher, and he's going to help us understand some useful literacy strategies that might help those young people kind of prepare and become more prepared and confident in these types of questions.
Thanks, Helen. So I suppose as an English teacher, in terms of promoting literacy and supporting students in decoding these kind of style of questions, I always think that strong literacy always equals a kind of stronger performance regardless of the topic that the students are faced with. So we know that literacy now, isn't just the domain of English teachers. Every subject requires pupils to interpret, analyse and respond to complex exam style questions. So if students can't decode what a question is specifically asking them, then their subject knowledge might not actually get the opportunity to shine through. So I've just put together an example of a few things that I thought might be relevant in a kind of broader context to address learners' abilities to access these kind of styles of questions. So the first one that I thought of was the explicit teaching of command words. So one of the most kind of widely used techniques, I suppose, by English teachers would be command words, boxing a command words and underlining keywords of a question, glancing back to ensure that they have a full understanding of the question, because it encourages the students to actively engage with the language of the question before even attempting the answer. So for example, in English, a question might begin with, analyse how a writer presents conflict in this extract. Students would box the word analyse, underline presents conflict, and then recognise that the focus is on exploring how language and structure convey conflict, rather than simply what we often kind of come up against, which is pupils describing the events of a plot. I think it's a technique that's kind of equally valuable in subjects like history, where a student might be asked to evaluate the significance of an event, or in science, where they might be required to explain the effects of a chemical reaction, for example. So linking into that, using command word glossaries, which are effective in terms of our Bloom's taxonomy and our higher level thinking skills. Glossaries that help students to kind of understand precisely what is being asked of them, because terms like compare, justify, summarize, assess are common across subjects, but they can have subtle differences depending on your subject's context as well. So by explicitly teaching these words and their implications, we can kind of equip pupils to navigate these styles of questions in subjects that range from, geography to literacy and technology. I suppose looking for context clues I thought was very important, particularly when I was looking through the examples that we're gonna, I'll share my screen in a wee moment. It's a good strategy that helps learners kind of better understand exam style questions across a curriculum. So by identifying words or phrases that are surrounding unfamiliar terms, the students can infer meaning and they can clarify what the question is actually asking them. So it's a technique that kind of encourages active reading, it reduces misinterpretation, especially in subjects like history or geography or science, where there might be technical or kind of subject specific vocabulary. So for example, in biology, and I'm not a scientist by any means, but there might be a question about photosynthetic rates. So context clues for things like light intensity or carbon dioxide levels might help students link the term to prior knowledge and guide them towards an appropriate response. So encouraging that use of context clues empowers learners to become more independent and confident when they're tackling complex or especially unfamiliar questions across all subject areas. And further to that, the use of reading comprehension strategies, central to understanding kind of different stimuli, like we've already seen quite a lot of graphs, or we're going to see some case studies or source texts. Techniques like skimming, scanning, annotating, summarizing are things that we would use as an essential practice in English. But I feel that sometimes the trap that we fall into, and we'll see that in the upcoming example, is that encouraging pupils to skim the question without indicating that they should read the example given in detail can result in them missing context and providing therefore incorrect answers. So with that in mind, I thought I'd run through a few examples of how this could be applied to the questions in context. So I will just share my screen. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see my screen there. These are questions that are all based on Rapa Nui. So it's something that was unfamiliar to me when I read it at first. It's the kind of Easter Island statues. So having a look through this question, if we're looking at things like context clues, if I went to the passage, immediately something I noticed was this word extinct. Learners will tend to bring their prior knowledge of words, but not look at the word in the context. So I suppose if we were to look at the words beforehand, things like old, now extinct volcanoes kind of could lead learners to the correct inference, you know, suggesting that the volcano is now inactive as a result of being extinct. I think boxing command words over here. So when and key topic words, did she start her fieldwork? So once pupils have selected their answer, they would glance back at the key statements to ensure that their chosen option matches the question's specifications. And this is important because at a glance, a lot of the options that are given are a mix of numbers and letters. And pupils could be inclined to, you know, simply match a date like 1990 here to the options that are available. So when you scroll down, the number kind of jumps out. And immediately, if the pupil hasn't spent that time contextualizing and understanding the command words of the question, they might be inclined to select that as the correct answer. So by boxing and underlining the command words as the key topic words, they're less likely to make that mistake in terms of the context of the passage and understand that actually up here is the answer to the question, that it was 9 months ago that she started her field work. In terms of this question that I was having a look at as well, so this is referring to the review of the collapse, which is an extract on the right here. And listed below are statements from the review of collapse. Are these statements facts or opinions? Click on either. So the learner has to kind of first understand the literal meaning of each statement and then decide whether the content's factual or represented the kind of perspective of the author of the review. So in that way, the pupils have to focus on the content and how it's presented rather than just the meaning. So actually, just by looking at the style of the options that they're given, they can kind of deduce whether it's going to be a fact or an opinion. So kind of closely reading the statements, you know, highlighting key phrases that reveal whether the information is verifiable facts or someone's viewpoint. So for example, down here, the book is written well, immediately kind of prompting the student to understand that this is something that's being given as an opinion rather than a fact. And over here, we've got things like Rapa Nui was settled by Polynesians, you know, a factual statement, a historical statement. So boxing those command words, fact, opinion, I think is helpful in this scenario. Asking students to consider the kind of context of the statement. So the passage presents data or anything that can be verified. So historical events, dates, and statistics, they're more likely facts. Whereas if the passage presents kind of interpretations, judgments, or subjective language, so things like disturbing or deserves to be read, they are kind of most likely the opinions. I'll just take you through one more example here before I let everyone kind of go, and as we've done previously, have a look at the reading style questions. This is a kind of more challenging question, and I think that, so what it's asking is to refer to this article, which is the third one on the right, and click on a choice to answer the questions. So what evidence do they present to support their theory on why the large trees of Rapa Nui disappeared? So kind of spotlighting words like refer to, evidence, and thinking about support their theory, I think are really important in this scenario here, because it's effective in leading learners towards the correct outcome. As a learner, what potentially could be my downfall here is that I actually have access to 3 different articles at this stage. So as you transition through the questions, you're given more options. And without paying close attention to those context clues, I would have been inclined to kind of trawl through information from all of these. Whereas actually, with this information, it's signaling to pupils that these words should be highlighted. We can kind of most effectively guide them towards success. So it says, support their theory. It's actually mirrored down here in the kind of last section of the paragraph. As soon as they see those words support their theory, the answer is given in the immediate aftermath. So Lipo and Hunt point to the remains of palm nuts that show the gnaw marks made by rats, and that would kind of lead us towards the correct conclusion here.
Andrew, sorry, I'm not sure if we're seeing it on screen, or maybe the screen is frozen, but we're still on the first page of the question.
Oh, no, sorry, I'm not sure why that's... Is that a little bit better now?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And no, that is brilliant. And I'm just wondering whether you could maybe give some information related to how do these types of reading questions compare with what we would see in national qualifications for someone doing English at age 15, 16?
So what I would say is the structure of the questions that are provided for PISA accommodates the learners in terms of giving them options for the kind of correct route to go down. Whereas in the national papers, really we're relying on them immediately being able to understand and identify the keywords of the question, and as a result know organically how to produce their own independent answer, as opposed to being kind of provided with the options. So I think what I'm trying to kind of communicate is how we get them to read this question really clearly, because I think given the options, sometimes learners will be inclined to think that it's perhaps an easier response. But it's not actually the case when they're kind of pairing up the information that's provided here. So as I say, the theory of why the large trees in Rapa Nui disappeared, all of these different options actually appear viable in a kind of skim of the passage. So as I said earlier, I think encouraging the learners to read these kind of shorter extracts in a lot more detail, so that they're very clear on the demands of the question and which one's the correct path, essentially.
Oh, fantastic. That is great. We're now at just after 5 o'clock, and we all want to make sure that we finish the session at one, sort of after 5:15, so roughly about 5:15. Just wondering, Andrew, if you could put up the link or the code. I think, Helen, is it in the PowerPoint? What we could do is let people access the question, but I'm very much inclined at this point to stop the recording and to ask people to come in if they would like to share some reflections or they have some questions. So I'm just going to stop the recording at this point, folks.
Sort of PISA define as the competencies developed by science education. So it is just about how we're preparing young people to be scientifically literate and just to deal with the real world and all the information that's coming towards them from lots of different ways, especially the kind of internet and that easily access of data. If we just move on to the next slide, please. I'll just go through this quite quickly, I think. There are these key competencies and within 3 different contexts, so a sort of personal context, a local or national context, and then also a global context. And you can see that the science competencies kind of at the top, that's kind of like your knowledge and understanding, I think. So explaining phenomena scientifically, the research, evaluate and use scientific information for decision making. To me, that's really about them being scientifically literate and being able to cope in the modern world where a lot of information is shared online. And then the kind of construct and evaluate designs for scientific inquiry is really your investigative skills. And so they're being assessed on those by those kind of simulation and the drag and drop experiments that we saw previously. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So here is just a bit more detail about that first competency. So about the knowledge, predicting, hypothesizing are all kind of words that they're familiar with, but also explaining potential implications of scientific knowledge for society is maybe taking them one step higher into higher order thinking skills that provides that additional challenge. If we can move on to the next slide, please. And here we've got the kind of steps in the kind of evaluation of scientific inquiries. And again, these are going to be some terms that they are familiar with as sort of going through curriculum for excellence science within the curriculum. I'll just ask you to move on to the next slide. I'm conscious of time. So this is a kind of mapping of our current BGE Sciences curriculum against the PISA science framework. And the bits in red we think are maybe the ones that are going to provide kind of additional challenge for young people, so they're maybe less familiar with those types of questions. And particularly the idea of science identity. So this to me is kind of encompassing their feeling of science, like what science is and what is it to them, and their feelings on science and whether science appeals to them as a person, and can they be a scientist, and sort of thinking about their science capital as well. So if we can move on to the next slide. I think there was a couple of slides in the slide deck couple on, which talked about so we've obviously had the group discussion. So the next one, there's a couple about, and the next one, the support package. So we've obviously got some films out there which you can show to your learners. If we go into the next slide as well, I think there were some tips just for, and the next one, and the next one. Here we go. So I think one of the participants was asking about what specific support to give, and there's some kind of examples here that you might want to do. So the school PISA coordinator, a lot of information is in that manual, but also just raising awareness and the positive aspects of the PISA assessment and what it means for global education as well as Scottish education. A couple of videos that you could show pupils, then other videos that you would probably just show to the young people that were selected, and then familiarising them with those styles of questions as well. And the next slide. Yeah, just thinking about building resilience, encouraging those kind of higher order thinking skills and reflection and justification and critical thinking, and then using questioning strategies that might align with the PISA thinking would help prepare your young people for this. I think that's me.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was great. Sorry, folks, I know it's after time. Just very quickly, two things that I want to highlight to you. Obviously, I've put in the chat, but all of these, all of the information and links and so forth are on the Education Scotland website. This will be going on to that Education Scotland website page around PISA 2025 support package. I will also send out the links to this to you since you've signed up for the webinar. There is another webinar on science vocabulary webinar that's taking place this week. So the information is here. Again, we will send this out to you so you can take full advantage of that. Next slide, Ian. And I think this will be the last one, which should be the evaluation. Be great if you can use a QR code here to access the evaluation form. Give us some feedback on the session itself, things that worked, things that we could improve for next sessions. And just a reminder that we have our third webinar next Tuesday at 4 o'clock, and we will be exploring a little bit more in depth around the three main domains and the content, but a little bit more into the science framework since it's the main domain for the testing in September. So please use the QR code, and thank you so much for being part of this webinar today. If you would like to stay on the call, if you've got any burning questions that you would like to ask us, we're still available here. I will stop the recording in the next few seconds, but thank you so much, folks. Have a lovely evening, and hopefully this has been a little bit more information, a bit valuable for you around participation in PISA and what that means. And as Paul said earlier, please use this, whether you are a participating school or you're not a participating school. The style of PISA questions are really what we want to get to with our 21st century curriculum. So this is all going to be great for learners and practitioners, both sides here. So thank you, have a lovely evening, and please stay on if you would like to ask some more questions.